it's a pleasure to be here. There's so many good people in Goldsboro, and I've been here several times. Bill Bretman invited me here years ago. I know many of you know him. And I'm honored every time I come here by the, let's say, the intellectual curiosity and engagement of this community. It's really remarkable. And also the way that people care about public education. And as Kay said, I'm at Carolina Public Humanities. We're very involved with public education. So what I want to do tonight is talk about an issue that is a big part of our lives in the contemporary world, the history of nationalism. And I'm calling this the cultural and political power of modern nationalism. And I want to try to provide a framework for understanding it and give some examples of how I think it has such power in the contemporary world. And then I hope we'll have a little time at the end for some discussion. Nationalism is definitely a complex and controversial subject. And it's one of the most powerful and widespread ideologies in the modern world. In fact, I would even make an argument that nationalism may be the most pervasive and powerful ism in modern times. That is, it crosses all parts of the world. And I think that we cannot understand modern European or American history or global history without understanding nationalism. And I put up here a famous painting by Emanuel Luzzi from 1851 of Washington crossing the Delaware, which sort of brings together a lot of nationalist symbols, George Washington, future president, a flag, soldiers, overcoming adversity, struggling in a battle against enemies. And I think this image is kind of a good place to start. And my overall thesis is, as I say, that nationalism is the most influential ism of modernity because it defines both personal and collective identities. When people describe who they are, they meet someone anywhere in the world, one of the first things they might say would be, you know, I'm American, or I'm French, or I'm German, or I'm Chinese. People, that's a category of identity that people use all the time, and it is closely linked to all kinds of other events in modernity, including modern wars, modern conflicts, modern violence. And I think we would probably agree that nationalism has shaped many of the wars of the last 2 centuries, at the very least. And nationalism has to be understood as something that motivates people to join into warfare. And that's one reason it has so much power. But nationalism also creates great hope. And this is another reason why nationalism is so powerful. It is part of an aspiration that people have. When they don't have a national state or a national government, they dream somehow of having that. Even in our own time, there are still peoples in the world who yearn to have their own state. And this has been a very powerful hope, as we know from our own history of George Washington, the hope of creating an independent country. So what I want to do then is talk about why it's such a big issue right now. So I want to suggest that nationalism is a key element of our public culture now. It has had a resurgence since the election of Donald Trump. People are often using this term, even Trumpism. What it means that it's a certain kind of nationalism that reconnects with certain traditions, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We've seen Brexit, which is a resurgence of nationalism in Britain, as you know, withdrawal from the European Union. There is a resurgence of various kinds of ethnic nationalisms around many parts of Europe, including in France. I put up here Emmanuel Macron, who just barely, well, he won the election last year in France over the National Front, Marine Le Pen. And there is a kind of ethnic nationalism that is expanding in many parts of the world. In fact, I heard just this weekend that in Italy, a nationalist party, an anti-immigrant group, has won a large number of seats in the new parliament. So I want to suggest that there is a resurgence of nationalism, and that I want to suggest also that there are two kinds of nationalism that are often connected, but I think we can draw a distinction between them. One we might call ethnic nationalism, which stresses that the meaning of a nation is defined above all by certain racial, ethnic, religious, linguistic traditions. It's sometimes called the blood and soil conception of nationalism, that a nation is defined above all by a kind of ethnicity or cultural essence, or racial essence even, as opposed to another kind of nationalism that says the nation is defined primarily by a set of shared beliefs. We'll call that a belief in certain rights, the belief in certain institutions. And if one adheres to a civic nationalism, there is usually the assumption that people can join the nation if they accept those civic values. That is, you don't have to belong to a certain race or religion or cultural tradition. If you embrace those values, you can become part of the nation. In Europe, this has often been portrayed as a dichotomy, for example, between German nationalism, which was historically more of an ethnic nationalism that put a lot of emphasis on ethnicity, language, race, as opposed to French nationalism, which was the abstract rights of man and citizen, the idea of certain democratic institutions. Actually, I think these two kinds of nationalism often overlap. There is plenty of ethnic nationalism in France or in America, for example, but France and the United States were often defined as countries with a more powerful civic nationalism. So I want to connect this partly to Trumpism, which in some ways has pushed us back toward a certain kind of European ethnic nationalism. So nationalism is both a political and cultural movement. I put up here an image of the Vietnam War Memorial, which is one of the symbols of nationalism in our own country. These are flags. This was a remembrance of 9/11 that someone put up a few years ago, I think maybe on the 10th anniversary. And I want to suggest that nationalism has enormous emotional power because it is similar to religion. And this is going to be my recurring theme, that nationalism evokes feelings that can be compared to a religious identity. And I'm going to suggest all of the ways in which that happens. But one of the reasons people are willing to die for their country, to kill for their country, or to accept the loss of their loved ones is because the nation has a kind of transcendent meaning. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is the belief that a group of people share a kind of cultural or political or historical essence that creates something like an internal unity, and is represented by the notion of the sovereignty of the people, that the people as a whole represent the nation. So there is always an emphasis on an internally united population, and there is always an emphasis on an external difference. Nationalism has no meaning without others, without difference, without some group of people who are not inside the nation. And so it is always a process of attempting to create internal unity and defining that identity against an external difference or other of some kind. I put up here the famous painting by Trumbull of the Declaration of Independence in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, 1776. And this is Jacques-Louis David's famous image of the tennis court oath, in which the people in France in 1789, their representatives are saying, "We are the people. We will not adjourn until we have created a constitution and created a nation that represents the will of the people." So I want to argue, and this is a big debate, when does nationalism begin? But I want to suggest that modern nationalism begins in the period of the American and French revolutions in the late 18th century. And one of the ways to define it is that before this time, the king was defined in France, for example, as the sovereign. You say His Majesty, the sovereign king. From this time forward, it is the people as a whole who are defined as the sovereign power. And so this is what nationalism consists of, an attempt to represent the sovereignty of the people. One other element, I put Trump's picture up here again because there's a debate, ongoing debate, about what is the nature of American nationalism. And I'm sure you've probably heard this term American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different from all other countries. And this is certainly something that Trump and many others advocate. But one of the things, I want to make an argument that in fact, much of what is now developing under Trump's definition of nationalism is closer to traditional forms of European nationalism, particularly insofar as it stresses the danger of certain ethnic or outside groups, and that what makes American nationalism truly exceptional is it has a tradition of what we might call multicultural nationalism. That American nationalism differed from other nationalisms in Europe in not stressing ethnic exclusions and in not limiting the national identity to one linguistic or national tradition. So we can talk more about that. European nationalisms in the modern period have often talked about the loss of greatness in the past because many European nations have gone into crisis. European nationalisms have often stressed the idea of overcoming past defeats through strong leadership. So I want to suggest that there are certain elements of nationalism, what I'm calling in the period of Trump, that actually resemble European nationalisms, and I'm suggesting that that's ironic because the argument of American exceptionalism is being used to support a kind of nationalism that actually links us more to European nationalism. And again, we can discuss that. So here is, we'll call this the ethnic nationalism. It's very important in the Brexit movement, in the protest against immigration. It defines immigrants as somehow not truly part of the nation. We certainly have seen this also in our country. This is one version of it, close the borders now, or immigrants yes, illegals no, a fear of outsiders. Of course, the most extreme form is what we might call a white ethnic nationalism. But there is, at the present time in the U.S., and this is not new, by the way, there's often been a kind of anxiety about multicultural communities in America, but there is, at the moment, a resurgence of what we might call ethnic nationalism. And the other kind of nationalism in America is linked more with the notion of civic nationalism, which stresses immigration as the essence of American national identity. So this is a perennial debate in American society. Is America essentially a sort of nation defined by an Anglo-Saxon or white or Christian tradition, or is it above all a nation of immigrants? And here's an image of people becoming citizens, pledging allegiance to the country. And the recurring tendency is to debate the meaning of this term, e pluribus unum. This is on every dollar bill, and this has always been the question. What does that mean, e pluribus unum? Out of many comes one. And this is the classical definition also of civic nationalism because it assumes people can come into the country and become Americans even if they were not of a family from America. And the classic definition of this, account of this, is this poem by Emma Lazarus, that part of which is now on the Statue of Liberty. This was about when the Statue of Liberty was erected and with a gift from the French. Here at our sea-washed, sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles, from her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That, if you wanted a microcosmic poetic expression of civic nationalism, that's the poem that's summarizes it. So one of the fascinating things about American nationalism is that it has always consisted of a debate between what we might call a more ethnic, linguistic, religious definition of the nation and a more civic, political, human rights definition of the nation. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're in conflict, and I would argue right now they are in quite a conflict within our own society, but not only in our own society, also in Europe. So let's go back to the history. Hey, I'm a fan of the French Revolution. I mean, French Revolution is not what it used to be. It used to be something everybody wanted to study. Now I find myself in a room alone sometimes debating what is the French Revolution. Oh, I have the Senate. Yeah, well, okay. So here's, I once wrote a book about Lafayette, so whenever I give a talk, I just have to slip in a little bit of Lafayette. Is there anybody here from Fayetteville? Fayetteville, all right. There's our man, Lafayette. Yeah, okay. Lafayette. You know, Fayetteville is the first city in America named for Lafayette. Did you know? I mean, it just sends trembles down my spine whenever I think. Anyway, Lafayette was one of the original authors of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was proclaimed in France shortly after the storming of the Bastille. You've heard about that big event in 1789, which launched the French Revolution. And French nationalism stressed that all human beings should have equal legal rights and that each culture is an expression of certain universal rights. And they passed this declaration, which is sort of like our Declaration of Independence, which summarizes the meaning of the rights of man and citizen. This is the origin of what we'll call civic nationalism. So it says, the representatives of the French people constituted as a national assembly and considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole cause, this is a very optimistic view of human problems. The sole reason we have problems is people don't know their rights, but here we are, we're going to tell you what your rights are. The sole cause of public misfortunes and governmental corruption have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man. First, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility. You're not given certain rights because you're born as a nobleman or as an elite government official. Nope, everybody's equal. The purpose of all political association is to preserve the natural rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. And finally, the principle of all sovereignty rests essentially in the nation. Nobody and no individual may exercise authority which does not emanate expressly from the nation. And that is the core theme of modern nationalism. All laws and institutions must come out of the people themselves and their representatives. And this is different from the conception of empire. You know, if you look at the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire or the great empires of other eras, there are people of many different religions, races, languages, nationalities. There is no notion of the sovereign people. There's sort of an overarching government, people who have different languages, traditions, cultures. The modern conception of the nation is a unified cultural tradition and history, and that this unified society or culture shapes the economy, it shapes the education, It is part of everybody's daily life. You can't imagine how much every day your life is affected by nationalism. Every time you pay a bill, every time you buy a stamp, every time you go to a sporting event, every time your kids go to a scout event, nationalism is literally everywhere. You can't go to a single basketball game or football game without people coming in with a flag, singing the national anthem. It is part of daily life. So, this is the question. Why did nationalism gain so much emotional power? It's not just that it's everywhere, it's that people feel deeply moved by this experience of identifying with the nation. There's nothing that elicits more anger than people feeling their nation is being attacked, or that the symbols of their nation, let's take these flags, French flag, American flag. Burning a flag is one of the most provocative things anyone can do in any country. And it evokes enormous emotional reaction. Even though it's, on one level it's just a piece of cloth, or, what does it mean? It's a symbol. So here's the question. You might say this is the framing question that I want to talk about. Why are people willing to kill, to die, or to lose their loved ones for nations? An abstraction. A nation is an abstraction. That people who don't know each other share a belief in that abstraction. This is a famous piece of sculpture by a man named François Roudet on the Arc de Triomphe. Has anybody here ever been to the Arc de Triomphe? Aha! That's French nationalism. I don't know how to describe it. Napoleon put this thing up there. It lists every battle he ever, fought. He doesn't have Waterloo on there, by the way. He didn't. Anyway, so why then does it evoke such emotion? I want to suggest this link to religion. There is a kind of historical tradition that argues that nationalism became connected with religion. And, there's a man named Carlton Hayes a long time ago. He lived through the First World War, and he was baffled by why so many people were willing to kill and die in the First World War. 10 million people probably died in that war. And he came to the conclusion, so I'm borrowing this framework, that it has such power because it evokes a religious sense. And why did that happen? Hayes argued that in the 18th century, with the rise of secularism, the rise of modern science, the Enlightenment, a new kind of skepticism about religion caused many people to lose their faith in God or in the transcendence of a divine being. And yet he argued that there is within each human being a need to believe in something greater than the self. That we're all anxious about our own vulnerability, our own weakness, our own mortality. And therefore, the nation came, for many people, to replace the meaning of God. This is a quote from this article. Religious sense is expressed in a mysterious faith in some power outside of himself. This is outside of oneself. A faith always accompanied by feelings of reverence and usually attended by external acts and ceremonial. People seek some object outside of themselves to which they might pay reverence. He says all people have this need to believe in something greater than themselves. And so they have a religious sense. Now, I think, in fact, many people would challenge, Hayes. They might say, well, maybe religion didn't really get replaced. Maybe religion actually fused with nationalism. Many people believe both in the nation and in God. But in any case, he himself had what's kind of called the displacement theory. And therefore, people came to, in a sense, worship the nation. And he says, this develops in the period of the French Revolution. It develops in the period of Napoleon and in the resistance to Napoleon. there was a huge sort of surge of opposition to the expansion of Napoleon. This is not a very clear image, but Napoleon, he basically took control of all of Europe between 1800 and 1812. And then he went off, he went up here to Russia, and he got into big trouble. He lost 600,000 men. Napoleon was never quite the same after that. But the resistance to Napoleon helped to create new kinds of nationalism in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, and the meaning of nationalism developed in that period. So how then can we think about nationalism as a religion? I want to use this as a framework. I want to suggest that there are three ways in which nationalism comes to resemble a religion. In the first place, it is, let's say in the most general sense, it is a response to anxiety about death. I want to make a general statement. I think most human beings have some anxiety about death. This is the absurd thing. We're such interesting creatures. We live interesting, rich lives. And doesn't it seem absurd that we have to die? I mean, I hate to be so blunt about it. Let's just throw that out there. I know I'm not shocking anyone with this revelation. So what do you do about that? I mean, this is a big problem. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So religions have had enormous power for millennia because religions give us a way to cope with this fundamental, absurd contradiction about our existence. And so if we think about nationalism as a response to the anxiety about death, I think we can see, like with a religion, that all nationalisms have a theology, that is a set of beliefs, set of ideas. All nationalisms have certain rituals at which those beliefs are affirmed and celebrated in communal acts, like in religious services. And all nationalisms provide some kind of consolation. The consolation that although you will die, your nation will live on, and therefore there is a kind of connection to eternal life. So I want to look briefly now at these three concepts: theology, rituals, and consolations. The Vietnam War Memorial, which is a very moving place. I assume many of you have seen this, where the names of all those who died in the Vietnam War are listed. This is another memorial service honoring people who were killed in 9/11. So theology. What is the theology of nationalism? The theology, let's say the belief system, refers to beliefs that kind of transform the nation into a divinity. Why do I want to compare it to a divinity? Because like God, the nation existed before you were born, and while you're alive, you have a link to that nation. It gives meaning to your life. It gives you a connection to something greater than yourself. And then, after you die, you know the nation will be there. It's eternal. It may not be eternal, but it's going to live on for a long time. And the metaphors of the nation often resemble the metaphors of language. So we talk about God the Father, but in the nation might be called the fatherland or the motherland, or something that suggests an origin, a source of our lives, and something that goes beyond us. And related to this is the notion that in some way each nation is like a chosen people. This is a very important notion of the Hebrew tradition. It's very much in the Bible. The notion that God chooses certain people, and those people have a certain destiny, a certain mission, and certainly this is very much in both the Jewish and Christian tradition. And it gets linked up with the notion of national exceptionalism because it assumes no other nation is like our nation. We have a destiny, a chosen mission. I want to show an example of this by quoting a man named Abraham Kettletos. I imagine I know everybody's heard of Einstein. Has anybody heard of Abraham Kettletas? No, of course not. He was a pastor during the American Revolution in Massachusetts. And I was writing a book about nationalism and reading sermons. And this is what Kettletas said. This is in 1777 in a sermon, talking about why people should support the American Revolution against the British. It is the cause of heaven against hell. It is the cause for which heroes have fought, patriots bled, prophets, apostles, martyrs, confessors, and righteous men have died. Nay, it is a cause for which the Son of God came down from his celestial throne and expired on the cross. So, which side are you on? I mean, I can't really be a preacher in 1777, but just imagine, this is it. This is absolute good against evil. And this is often called Messianic Nationalism because it links the fate of the nation to images of Christ. Messianic Nationalism became very important in Poland and in other parts of Europe. There was a poet named Adam Mickiewicz who basically said that Poland was the Christ of nations. It had been crucified, dead, and buried by the Russian Empire. That's what happened. I mean, actually, it's true. Poland got wiped off the map. And he said, but just as on the third day, Christ arose from the tomb and brought life eternal to other people, so Poland will rise from its death and it will become the source of all people's freedom, and it will have a destiny beyond the Poles themselves. So I mention this because literally there are some nationalists who narrate the meaning of their national story by comparing it to the death and resurrection of Christ. More often it's like Kettletas, who says, our nation has universal significance, just like Christ has universal significance. What happens to us matters because it has universal religious meaning. This is the theology. And if the nation is eternal, you as a person in this nation have a duty to serve. Just as a good Christian has a duty to serve God in everything you do, no sacrifice is too great if you're a true believer, so the citizen has a duty to serve. Ask not what your country can do for you. I'm quoting now. I didn't make this up. I'm now quoting John. John Kennedy. Ask what you can do for your nation. But he borrowed this idea from a long tradition of nationalists. This is Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a great Italian nationalist in the 19th century. And Mazzini once said, in 1844, the cry which rings out in all great revolutions, the cry of the Crusades, God wills it, God's wills it, proves to me that the work of emancipation and of progressive development to which you call them is part of God's design. God wills it, God's wills it. It is the cry of the people. Oh, brothers, it is the cry of your people, the cry of the Italian nation. If you are going to be a good person, you must serve the nation, just as a good Christian must always serve God. And that means paying a price, sacrificing, giving your money, your service, your blood. That's the theology of nationalism. The second component, we'll call it the rituals and sacred rites of nationalism, connects with all kinds of symbols that celebrate national identity. There can be no national identity without a set of rituals. I've already mentioned, like, every time you go to a football game or a basketball game, it begins with a national ritual that shows the linkage of all the people. It has a song. It may honor it has soldiers. And all nationalisms celebrate national identity with a set of symbols that can be compared to religious symbols. So just as, again, to go back to Christianity, if you have a cross, which is a symbol of the Christian faith, so every nationalism has a flag, which is a sacred symbol. That's why defacing the flag is a sacrilegious act. And they all have sacred text. This one happens to be the Declaration of Independence. And all nationalisms have certain texts that are defined as sort of they're not exactly the Bible, but they are sacred. You could never, for example, I don't think you would want to run for office in the United States, for example, by saying, I despise the Constitution. I think it's a horrible document. Please don't quote. This is how things get pulled out of. I didn't say that. I'm saying you wouldn't say that because that's a sacred document for our national identity, just as the Declaration of Independence is. So they all have sacred documents. They may have sacred texts, like maybe we have the Gettysburg Address, or like I mentioned, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They also all have, like religions, sacred figures. This is an image from the early 1800s of Washington. It's sort of like Moses bringing the tablets, the lawgiver. You see the fusion there, imagery of Washington with images of Moses. So all nations have heroes, sacred figures who are like saints in a religious tradition. But they also, in order to make sense, have to have evil figures, satanic figures. So how many of you have heard of Benedict Arnold? Would you raise your hand? He's doing a lot better than Abraham Kettletos, right? Nobody's heard of Kettletos. Everybody's heard of Benedict Arnold. Why? Whatever you do, don't grow up to be a traitor. That is Judas Iscariot of our national identity. He betrayed our sacred father, George Washington. So they also, all nationalisms have sacred places, just like religions. People go on pilgrimages to certain holy sites, or maybe they go to the Vatican, or maybe they go to some shrine or some very important site. So nationalisms have monuments. This is like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Arc de Triomphe is also a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Paris. They have battlefields where people go to honor those who died in the wars, sacred site. They have national holidays, just like we have religious holidays. They have Memorial Day, or the 4th of July, or Bastille Day. And at these events, there is always a desire to honor the dead, just as a religious service may honor those who've gone before, or when we gather in a church service, we may remember those who are no longer with us. And it is by honoring the sacrifice of the dead that people affirm the sense of mission or destiny. In order to honor those who have gone before, we must make no hesitation to take action ourselves. We shouldn't hesitate to act. And this leads to the symbolic meaning of soldiers. Because in every nationalism, soldiers are the group that is the most revered of all citizens. And I think this is because they also resemble Christ. Christ gave his life, his blood and body, that others might live. And soldiers give their blood and body that the nation might live. And I want to suggest this link to Christ-like imagery by using this very famous painting by Goya. This is one of the great paintings of the Napoleonic era. Goya was very angry about the French occupation of Spain. And these are Spanish, this is like the Spanish Revolutionary, the guerrillas. That's where the word guerrilla comes from, guerrilla, little war. And the French soldiers over here arrested these guerrillas and executed them. And you notice the person being executed. You notice he's illuminated like a Christ figure in the tradition of religious art. And the sacrifice of the soldier is often evoked in a way that resembles the sacrifice of Christ. And therefore, honoring those who died for the nation taps into the language of Christ who died for all humanity. And therefore, it becomes the modern religious imagery. And this painting, widely reproduced, is often seen as an example. You notice the blood, the bodies, the sacrifice, and the man about to be killed. So finally, and our rituals always recognize soldiers. Again, just as no one would ever condemn the Constitution, no one would condemn soldiers. Even when soldiers do bad things, that's why it's so disconcerting if soldiers do things that are bad, because they are the symbol of virtue. And then finally, consolation. This is the third element of religion. Because immortality is the central promise, let's say, of most religious traditions. And immortality is also promised through the permanent life of the nation. Of course, you will die, just like the soldiers will die. But your death and your life will have meaning because it is part of an eternal cycle of the meaning of the nation. And after you're gone, you will be remembered. You will have a certain kind of immortality. Your death will not have been in vain. And this idea that the survival of the nation is essential to your own survival helps to explain why people are so emotionally connected to the survival of the nation. If your nation should die, your memory would die too. If the nation lives, your identity will in some sense be sustained. This is Arlington National Cemetery. I'm sure many of you have been there as a national pilgrimage site. This is a philosopher named Johann Gottlieb Fichte. How many of you have read Fichte's collected works? He's in the Kettle-Toss. He's over there with Kettle, he's not getting a lot of airtime. Benedict Arnold's doing better. Anyway, Fichte lived through the Napoleonic Wars. He hated Napoleon. So he wrote a collection of speeches called Addresses to the German Nation. And basically he said, we must, as Germans, unite and gather as a people and drive out the heathen, horrible French. And though people will die, that doesn't matter because the nation will be resurrected from this conquest. This is from the Addresses to the German Nation in 1807. A lot of people have seen Fichte as one of the origins of certain kinds of radical modern German nationalism, of unpleasant consequences. This is what he said, though. I don't think it's fair to blame Fichte for, say, Nazis, but this is his view. The noble-minded man's belief in the eternal continuance of his influence on this earth is founded on the hope of the eternal continuance of the people from which he has developed. Your eternal life depends on the survival of your people. Hence, the noble-minded man will sacrifice himself for his people. Life merely as such, the mere continuance of changing existence, has never had any value for him. He has wished for it only as the source of what is permanent. But this permanence is promised to him only by the continuous and independent existence of his nation. In order to save his nation, he must be ready even to die that it may live. Notice that sacrifice imagery. And that he may live in it the only life for which he has ever wished. You see the resonance there of how the nation is your consolation for your own mortality. You will die, but your nation will live eternally. I've focused on nationalism in Europe and America, but I want to suggest that one of the reasons nationalism has such global influence is that there are parallels in other religions, notions of sacrifice in the Islamic tradition, in Hinduism, in Shintoism. This happens to be a Shinto shrine in Tokyo to memorial to the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. And it gets linked to the religious rituals of commemoration, memory, and honoring the dead. So I'm not saying this is something only in the West, and it is something that translates into different cultures, but it resonates in our own culture because of the Jewish and Christian traditions. So, nationalism and the enduring power of religion. Nationalism, I'm back to my thesis now, has an enduring power in the modern world because it provides a coherent argument for independent political institutions, for the sovereignty of the people, for autonomous national states, for many political reasons. But the most enduring emotional power of nationalism comes because it provides a response to the fundamental dilemma of the human condition, that dilemma of our own mortality, and the profound sense of belonging. This is an interesting question. How is it that we as human beings feel comfortable and safe? It is because we belong to a community of people, because we are connected to other people. And therefore, nationalism provides a sense of belonging. It responds to the anxiety about death, and it links the personal to a higher power, in this case, the power of the nation. And what we are seeing in American society today is a kind of resurgence. There's always nationalism, but there has been a resurgence of nationalism, I would say especially since 9/11, a concern that the nation is our main bulwark against danger. The threat to our own existence comes from the outside, and therefore we must take every step we can to protect ourselves from that danger. Beginning, let's say, with 9/11, and this feeds into other anxieties about immigration, about fear of the other, about those who are deemed not to be entirely of the nation. And so here's the contemporary challenge of nationalism. How do we affirm identities, which I think we all have to be connected to something greater than ourselves? But how do we affirm our identities without lapsing into exclusionary nationalisms that then scapegoat others and lead to either violence or certain kinds of repression of difference? This is a recent British party called the British National Party, more extreme than the traditional Conservative Party, but stop the immigration. And this is behind a lot of the support for Brexit. So I think that Brexit and Trumpism, I'm calling these parallel movements, are a part of the reaffirmation of collective identities and nationalism that is reshaping our contemporary political culture. Looks like I made a couple of typos there, but never mind. What I'm asking is nationalism, I get so excited, anyway, is nationalism the most enduring political and cultural ideology and identity of modernity? Can we possibly live without nationalism? Will nationalism still be the dominant ideology 500 years from now? Or is nationalism going to be let's say, a way station on the way to some other conception of identity? Nationalism did not exist 2,000 years ago. It probably won't exist 2,000 years in the future, but right now it is our identity. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Is that okay, for questions now? Is that what we do? Okay, I want to throw the floor open. If you can answer this question, I appreciate it. Yes, I will.
I'm just curious how you view today's American nationalism.
How do I view it?
Two of them?
Two of them? I think there are. That's what I'm suggesting. I think there are two nationalisms, each claiming to represent the real meaning of America. That's one reason our society is so profoundly polarized.
Without going to 500 years, let's go to 10 years.
Okay, well, that's more realistic for most of us. I know that. So are you saying, will that be the case in 10 years? My short answer would be yes. It will be. I don't think it's about to, that competing set of identities is about to disappear. In fact, each is probably being solidified by its conviction that the other narrative of the American nation is wrong in some way. Now, I think that the fear of immigration is very strong right now, and that may change in 10 or 20, I think that will change in 10 or 20 or 50 years. But this, what I'm calling the two conceptions of the American identity, which one might be that America is a Christian nation, that it is essentially a European nation, that it is rooted in a certain, let's say, Protestant or Catholic or Christian tradition, versus what I'm calling the civic definition, that is rooted in a set of conceptions of human rights and universal principles. Those are in conflict on some level. So I don't see that ending right away. And in some ways, there's certainly a long tradition on both sides of that definition. Yeah? So.
In the 250 years that it has become prevalent,
Yeah.
does it seem to be superseding religion?
That's where I was saying I'm not sure that I accept that Carlton Hayes argument, that it simply replaced it. I think one of the reasons it often has the greatest power is that it tends to fuse with religion. And it's not just Christianity. I mean, there are certain kinds of Islamic nationalism as well, and Jewish nationalism for sure. I do think nationalism in Europe has declined in certain ways compared to 100 years ago. I mean, here, I'll be an okay, I want to be an optimist. I just said it may take 500 years. Think of 100 years ago in Europe. 1918, the First World War was ending. France and Germany had just had this unbelievable war. They were going to have another one. No one could have imagined in 1918 that there would be a time when France and Germany weren't having wars. And in a sense, the European Union kind of replaced that. And the problem, let's just say the problem or the challenge the European Union faces is it has a hard time evoking the same emotion that France or Germany or nations evoke. So my own view is that religion nationalism hasn't fully replaced religion, but it has tapped into the energy of religion to unite people who may disagree about religion. Look at all the religions we have in America, but we have this one national religion, or let's say we have two national religions, but we have 100 other religions. I mean, do you think religion has been replaced by nationalism?
I think it has stepped back some.
Religion has,
yes.
Yeah. And that nationalism provides something. That's my thesis. I think that's right. Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. That in some ways the emotional power of nationalism draws on the change in the status of religion, but taps into the emotional needs of religion. Yeah.
I may have misunderstood one of the earlier slides when you brought up the incident in Charlottesville,
Yeah.
where a small group of radicals, and depending upon who you listen to, it was staged, it wasn't staged, take it for what it's worth, that this represents a source of nationalism, even though they're a very small group of radical elements. I'm not sure I follow.
So I would agree that the Charlottesville thing was the extreme version of ethnic nationalism. I would definitely agree with that. Most, let's say, nationalists who stress the ethnic or, let's say, historical meaning of the nation in less human rights universal terms, they don't go as far. I mean, that's the extreme. Just like Nazis were the extreme of German ethnic nationalism.
Fortunately or unfortunately at the time, depending upon your view, going into our own history a little bit further down the line, the abolitionists started as a small radical group, which had an immense change into the government, and that's a whole other dichotomy. But I guess my point that I wasn't following, and I still may not, I'm not a history person, if we're giving credence at all to the existence of these small radical local groups, are we adding to their ability to affect change for better or worse?
Well, I don't think the ethnic nationalist dimension of American nationalism has been just a small marginal group. You know, you mentioned the abolitionists. That's a very interesting case because the Civil War is in a way, we're talking about two kinds of nationalism. The Civil War was the most extreme example of two competing narratives of American national identity. And the abolitionists claimed that the existence of slavery fundamentally violated the American creed of human rights. To enslave people violates the founding principle. And those who defended slavery said that there is a racial essence here that is legitimated, or that slavery represents, and that we are defending that tradition. So it was a definition of what it means to be American is you have to be white to be an American. If you are black, you do not have the rights that white people have. That's extreme ethnic, racial nationalism. I mean, you see what I'm saying? They're saying not only do these people not have the right to vote or hold office, they don't even have the right to be free because they're black.
Counter argument, just for the sake of argument. Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't the Constitution state that by identifying as property? The 3/5 notion? I'm not saying morally right or ethically right.
Well, that's exactly right. And those who they denounced the Constitution for exactly that reason. They said the Constitution violates the fundamental principle and the Constitution must be changed, which it was. And it had to be changed if that conception of what I'll call the civic meaning of nationalism was going to be established. That's why the Civil War, you know, this is linked to the French Revolution. A lot of people say, why wasn't the American Revolution as violent as the French Revolution? The French were so much more violent. And in fact, in my view, the Civil War is the last stage of the American Revolution. And it's even more violent than the French Revolution. Our revolution didn't end until the abolition of slavery was established as a constitutional principle. I mean, that's my view of the history of it. Yeah.
Do you see any parallels in the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s and the current rise of this modern nationalism?
I do see quite a bit of overlap in that of course, the Know-Nothing Party, you know, they were a very successful party in the 1850s, and they won quite a bit of electoral power in certain places. And they defined the nation very much in ethnic terms. They were hostile to immigrants, obviously. They hated the Irish at that time. They were very fearful of Catholics coming into the country. So the immigrants they were most worried about were not Mexicans or Asians, but they were Irish. And then there were later movements that were very hostile to the immigration of Jews and people from Eastern Europe. This is in the 1890s. And then, of course, in 1924, when the most extreme anti-immigration bill was passed at that point. I actually see the period we're living in now as most similar to the 1920s in some ways, that there's a kind of anxiety about, you know, let's get back to what we were before we got involved in the whole world. You know, that's the reaction.
Asian immigration laws and so forth.
Yeah, in 1924, and the restriction to try to focus on immigration from Northern Europe rather than Southern or Eastern Europe or from Asia. And now there's an attempt to create an immigration flow from Northern European countries or highly educated elites and block other kinds of immigration. So, I mean, none of this is new. It's a recurring debate about, that's why I put the Statue of Liberty up there. The Statue of Liberty is always contested. I heard this guy, Stephen Miller, who's a Duke graduate, and there's nothing against Duke. I'm sure there are Duke fans in here, so this is kind of like let's talk about sports and nationalism. Anyway, remember there was a debate when they were introducing some new ideas about immigration, and somebody said, well, what about the Statue of Liberty? And they quoted that poem from Emma Lazarus, and he said, that wasn't on the Statue of Liberty. It was added later. And someone else said, but that's the spirit of the Statue of Liberty. He said, no. So even the Statue of Liberty falls into a debate between the two concepts of identity and American nationalism. And we thought the Statue of Liberty was just standing there. No. The battle goes on. That's why I put that poem up there, you know. Yeah, that's why I think the 1920s are an interesting parallel. See how important history is, though? How could we make sense of any of this? If we didn't know that all this had been part of a long history, we would feel, what has it happened to us? No, just another day at the national office. Yeah, please.
You know, I mean, I'm intrigued by the premise that we have, in terms of nationalism, have become more European. In terms of, I mean, if you think of the development of European diplomacy, kind of the realpolitik,
Yeah.
to things, and now our approach getting very similar, I would suggest that perhaps maybe there's so many hot spots of foreign affairs going on right now. How would you see that playing out with us having more of an exceptionalist approach to diplomacy now than traditionally in the past? Our argument is, albeit sometimes hypocritical, was primarily a moral one with the rest of the world. Now we're taking on more of the same approach that has caused many of the world wars.
So the reason I compared it to European nationalism is that a lot of the modern European nationalisms, including British nationalism, certainly German nationalism, Italian nationalism in the 20th century, was predicated on the anxiety that we, whatever the nation was, once were a great power. And we're not great anymore like we used to be. And what we need to do is to be more assertive. I mean, you know, that was the most extreme kinds of European nationalism. And we need to be assertive in defense of our traditions, not internationalist or universalist, but nationalist. And I do think that the America First ideology, which is not new, by the way, as I'm suggesting, it's not at all new, but it does resemble European nationalists who had great anxiety about the relative decline of their European countries in relation to, at that time, the rising power of the United States. So we didn't have that same anxiety, but now we have it. We've got a bad case of the European anxiety syndrome. I just made that up, European anxiety syndrome. We have the EAS. And what is the EAS? It is the anxiety that once we were great and we're not as great as we once were, so we must recover that greatness. And I mean, this has been a part of our anxiety in the United States, I would say, since the Vietnam War, because there's been anxiety. We don't want to repeat that loss, that defeat. And just to take the German example after the First World War, and I'm not drawing a parallel here to Nazism, but the great pain in Germany of losing the First World War can hardly be overestimated. They lost, like, I think close to 5 million deaths, and the feeling that for nothing, we must honor that sacrifice. And the same in our country. We've had these setbacks. It's been a long time since we had an unequivocal victory. I mean, really, you know, people always make fun of the French, for example. They lose a lot of wars. But since World War II, have we had an unequivocal major military? We've had a lot of wars, but we have never had our soldiers standing on the battleship Missouri again and saying, surrender. We had Korea that kind of ended messy. We're still dealing with it. We have Vietnam. We've had Afghanistan. We have Iraq, the wars that go on. The frustration that people feel when you cannot get a clear victory is what people felt in Europe when they couldn't get a clear victory. So I do think that when that happens, there are going to be leaders who rise and say, I'm going to do it. We need stronger leadership. The reason we're not winning is we don't have strong leaders. And I'm a strong leader. I'm going to get rid of corruption. This is why I say it's very familiar to anybody who studies European history. I studied way too much European history. I really need to get out more often. It makes me a little crazy. But this is why I'll put my cards on the table. I do not believe in American exceptionalism, except in that sense of multicultural. I think all nations have similar patterns. I'm too much of a historian to let go of that. And our patterns are very familiar to anyone who has looked at other countries that have gone through struggles that we've faced over the last 50 years. So, but I'm not saying we're going to repeat exactly what happened in Europe. We're a very different country. We're a very different culture. We have a much stronger economic base, but we face some of the same structural anxieties. Yeah.
You mentioned that World War II was our last closure victory.
Unambiguous victory.
Unambiguous victory.
Mm-hmm.
And since then we have not had a victory. But isn't it because in World War II we were attacked?
No, that's true. And also it was, we had a clear, well, I mean, Vietnam was a pretty clear enemy. But the problem now is our enemies are not like an obvious nation state that you just go and beat it. You know, that's what war used to be. We don't have wars like that now. We're not having wars. And that's what's so maddening. We have unbelievable power, but it's not very effective against that kind of enemy. Even Vietnam, you know, we couldn't do it. So that's what's so frustrating. That's why people are so frustrated. Yeah.
Okay, I'm probably going to wade into a minefield.
That's a good military analogy, actually. World War I.
The Cold War.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We won that one.
Mm-hmm.
We won it so good that the Soviet Union collapsed and fell into several pieces.
Yeah.
So that's one.
Yeah, but look what, I grant you, that's a great victory. But look what's happening now. There's tremendous anxiety, like Putin. Let's just take Putin, Mr. Putin. There is a great deal of fear. It's like, this is like whack-a-mole, you know? The Russians are, they're doing bad stuff. Where are those Russians? Don't they know they lost the Cold War? I mean, I grant you, that was a moment of great...
But we didn't have military parades over it.
No, because it didn't have a simple... It wasn't like a Battleship Missouri moment. It was complicated. It broke up. Eastern Europe fell into ethnic war. I mean, it was still messy. Yeah, but I think that was a huge nationalist psychological victory. And then I think and that's why maybe 9/11 was such a shock. You know, we thought, oh, what are we dealing with now? Last decade, we thought, you know, that was when they had the end of history. Remember that famous book? History's over. Hey, we won. But wait, what's going on? But I think you're right. The Cold War, but it was a little more ambiguous, you know, and it's still kind of haunting us. And now all we hear about, oh, the Russians are doing this, and the Russians are involved in our elections. And what are the Russians doing here? I'm not trying to pick on the Russians either. I'm not picking on Duke. I'm not picking on the Russians. I'm just saying it's complicated. Yeah. Wait, I'm sorry. Yeah?
We have not had a congressionally declared war since World War II.
That's right. We don't declare wars anymore, and we don't have Battleship Missouri endings anymore, but we just are in war a lot. And, but we don't get the satisfaction. It's like being in a game. It's like Carolina playing Duke, but the game never ends. Oh, what a nightmare. Now, I don't mean to keep picking on that analogy, but you know, it's like people want closure, and the world is way too messy for that. And even like you go back to the American Revolution, or even the Civil War, it came to an end. Now, you know, it kept happening, different things. Wars always have an afterlife. But there was a time when wars seemed to come to an end. It's now more like, if you study European history, we're a little more like the 100 Years' War. You know that one? It just never, you know, one generation died, the next generation came along. There are people now, think how long we've been in war since 2001. We've basically been in a war. We're not at 100 years yet, but we're at 17 years that we've been on a war, you know. There are people dying. There are wars going on. So that is the great challenge. How do you sustain a sense of national optimism and pride when you have to find a way to celebrate the nation without a clear military victory? Because, as I've said, that's often been the way national identities have been affirmed.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really enjoy Goldsboro.
And would you please, before everyone leaves, I would love for Lloyd just to show the Carolina Public Humanities book.
Oh, our
So if
brochure.
anybody
Yeah.
would like to sign up for
Hey,
the course, there-
This is a public service announcement. Is that what you're saying? So I come from Carolina, and I am not only a professor in the history department, I'm the director of this program called Carolina Public Humanities, and we have lots of programs, as Kay says, on the weekends, seminars with faculty speaking about different issues, and like what I just was trying to do, try to make sense of complicated problems with knowledge coming from the humanities, history and literature and philosophy and religion. And I can't say that we ever solve the problems that we talk about, but we always try to understand them. And if you can't understand them, you can't solve them. That's a generalization, but I'll go with it. So thank you so much. And if you'd like information, I've got a few copies, and you're always welcome to come to one of our programs. And one of the things we're trying to do is build more relations with partners like Wayne Community College. This Wayne Community College, you have a jewel right here in Goldsboro. And yes, and Kay, it's true. And I should mention, I have a colleague who's coming here. Rachel's coming, right? Rachel Shavitz in a couple of weeks. And we've been here before, and we hope we'll be back. Thank you all for coming.
On March 21st, Rachel Shavitz, who I think has been down, I think she came with you for the Napoleon seminar.
She came with us with Napoleon.
She's going to do a lunch and learn on, let's see, it's Wednesday, March 21st. Correct me, is that right?
It's March 21st, and it's the rise of the heroine in American films. The role of women and actresses in American film.
Lillian Gish to Katharine Hepburn to Sigourney Weaver. I mean, this is her area of expertise, and she will be talking about that. And you're all welcome, but you do need to sign up and register, so you have to call the office and register for that. But we'd love to have you there. And then the next one we'll have will be on the 26th of March. It'll be Miguel Pico, the flamenco guitar. He will be playing and talking about and giving background about that. So we hope to see him. That will be Monday at 7 o'clock in the evening. That'll be March 26th. So we're skipping a week and then going on. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.